First, big thank you to everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. This is going to be our 8th and final webinar of this academic year. My name is Laura Goodyear, and I'm a first-year PhD student in marketing at Rotman, Bear Research Coordinator and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BEAR, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose 3 programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, in particular, behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Avni Shah, an assistant professor of marketing from the University of Toronto, Scarborough, with a cross-appointment in the marketing area at the Rotman School of Management and the Munk School of Global Affairs. Before I introduce Avni, I'd like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab on the right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. So these questions will be visible to all participants, and at the end of the talk, with time permitting, we will have question and answer session in which I will select questions from the chat to ask our speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Avni. So using a multi-method approach combining field and lab experiments as well as empirical modeling, she investigates what motivates consumers' decision-making, spending, and well-being in household financial settings. Her research focuses on how financial technology like payment method, mobile payment, and SMS reminders for savings, as well as cultural and social forces like thinking about one's family, influences short-term spending decisions, such as buying a product or choosing a healthy versus unhealthy menu item, as well as more consequential long-term financial decision-making, like saving for retirement. Her work has been published in the Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, and Psychological Science. Avni is a research fellow at BEAR, as well as a research affiliate at Ideas 42, a non-for-profit design organization that uses behavioral insights to address complex social problems. Avni pursued her doctorate in marketing at Duke University and earned her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, double majoring in psychology and brain sciences and religion. Prior to beginning her career in academia, she worked as a research assistant at Dartmouth College Tuck School of Business, Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and was a research fellow at the National Institutes of Health. Thank you so much, Avni, for being here today, and take it away.
With basically the story that sort of prompted, or kind of the incident that prompted a lot of this research. And it began in my 3rd year of graduate school. So I had a habit of basically every morning getting up, getting dressed. I would I have a little yogurt to start my day. It's good for you. And then I would basically start my drive, my 10-minute drive from my apartment to my office at Duke University. Along the way, there were several different coffee shops. And what I ended up doing was I would just try different ones, you know, a little sake of variety, to basically buy the same thing. I would get a skim latte and pay using my debit card. And then I'd be on my way to start my day. Well, this one morning, I pull up and get into the Starbucks coffee shop. And as I'm taking out my wallet, I notice, well, I seem to have forgot my debit card at home. I did have money, like cash, on hand. And so then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, I have to now pay with this cash. But unlike the other transactions and the other experiences that I had, for whatever reason, this particular day with this skim milk, right, or this, skim latte, I didn't really want to part with my money. And I was like, I don't want to fork over my $5, right? And that was just the typical price. So I'm sitting there and I give away this money. Finally, she basically pry it out of my hands. And then now I'm well on my way. So as I get into school, I'm starting to sip this latte and I'm thinking, man, this tastes way better than usual. I'm really enjoying this. Right? Why don't I go to this, this coffee shop, this Starbucks, right? All the time. Something felt different. And then I started thinking, well, what was different about this experience versus the others? And it led me to this little picture right here. Well, typically I paid by debit. This time I paid by cash. So could it be, at least in this case, that the way that I paid influenced, well, maybe how I felt, right, at that point of purchase, that felt I didn't really want to give up that money. But then in turn, could that affect how I felt about my spending and about that purchase after the fact? Maybe it tasted better. I valued it more. Maybe I was more likely to want to go back there. And so what we're going to talk about today is this understanding of payment form and really the death of cash, right? What happens with our psychology, our consumer psychology? What happens in terms of the way that we spend, but also post-purchase? What's going to happen there? And now, of course, we're moving into digital payments. How does financial technology play a role? And how does it affect our spending? And what are the strategies that we can use to maybe help us out and maybe save a little bit more? Right? So a little roadmap. First of all, thank you very much for joining. I'm still going to answer, why should you not just go back to your lunch? Why should you care about the next few minutes here that we're going to chat about some of the research that I've done. We'll also talk about these theories of the concept of pain of payment and what is going on with different payment forms that create some of these psychological differences. We'll talk about how this payment form influences the purchase process in terms of different, basically, consumer psychological effects on choice overload, and even how it makes us think about other options that we could consider. And we're also going to talk about, well, how does the way that we pay influence our post-transaction connection? Just like that kind of Starbucks experience. And I'm going to show you a course of many different types of experiments. I'll show you some field experiments where we had people actually buy things, as well as even some panel data in order to show you how does this really work in the real world, if you will. And then finally, we'll end off with talking a little bit about how Venmo, Apple Pay, and all this digital transformation in financial technology, how that really changes the game in the landscape of our spending. How does that factor in? All right, so let's begin. So first thing is, obviously you guys have noticed, right, including with the recent Apple announcement of the Apple Pay and Apple Cash and what's going on there, that we have had huge changes in technology in our society and payment technology over the last, say, the 30 years. Just about 30 years ago, really paper dominated. Most people had spent with cash for 99% of transactions or very close to it, except for those big purchases where then check was the predominant form. And credit was used, of course, and plastic was used, but not nearly in the way that basically we see in our society today. Basically, towards the end of the 2000s, so about 2009, 2010, marked a switch from a dominance from paper forms of payment all the way to then now people dominating debit card and credit card and these plastic forms. And as you can see with what's going on with our apps, things like Venmo and Apple Pay, Apple Watches, for example, and even online transactions, we're now moving towards even a more digital and less even paper-based, even a less plastic-based payment society. Now, that's one thing. So we have to understand what happens psychologically because it affects many people in the payment landscape. But also, what I'm going to show you has these effects on just even some transactions. So let's talk about Starbucks, right? So that one transaction that I made, now think about people making transactions every day, let's just say at Starbucks. They sell on average about 2.3 billion transactions of coffee, of pastries, all sorts of things every year, right? In just the US alone, there's 60 billion transactions per day. And I'm going to show you some, what I think are pretty neat kind of big effects, but multiply this out. Right? We make on average a little bit, and across the globe, there's about 5 transactions plus per day. How do these things, basically this idea of payment technology and the way that we pay, that influences kind of everyday spending and everyday transactions. And so this is one of the reasons why you care. It affects all of us. Anytime that there's a difference in payment, it affects all of us. All right. So let's start with this. Right? According to economics, there's a theory of descriptive invariance. $10 is $10 is $10. It should not matter if the $10 is paper, right, like a cash bill, versus a debit card, because it's coming from, particularly with debit card, they're coming out from their account at the same time. Right? And so these should be identical in terms of how we think about this psychologically and how we spend. However, a number of different people have studied this idea of this pain of payment. And it's this concept that came up in 1997. It was coined by Robert Zellemeyer. And basically, it's defined as the psychological aversion or the disutility from making a payment. People do not like to part with their money. And different forms of payment have these different levels of pain associated with them. Now, of course, there are other factors that are definitely affecting the pain of payment. For example, some of the first research done in this area looked at temporal coupling. So it feels worse when you have to pay right then and there, right? Or when you have to pay first, right? And then enjoy the thing later, or enjoy whatever your experience, your item, whatever that purchase is, right? And that's called a temporal coupling. And the tighter that pleasure of consumption and that pain of payment, the tighter that's coupled, the more pain that we feel. And you maybe can relate to this in terms of credit cards. It feels pretty great spending with the credit card just until you get that bill. And then you open it up and you're like, oh, that's not so nice, right? Because it feels like there's not really, it's free almost. I mean, not to that extent, but certainly it doesn't feel as painful as when you're actually parting with different forms, right? Because it's not coming out of your account at the same time. There are also individual differences. So LeBron James, there's a piece where he says he doesn't really like change. He doesn't like $1 bills. He doesn't take any change. Anything below $10, they wouldn't even take it. It's not even interesting to him. And so just in case some of you out there are thinking maybe it's worthwhile to switch jobs, follow LeBron James around, right? And hope that he makes these small transactions, right? But for him, right, versus for me, $5 is kind of consequential. And there's a difference there. $5 for him is not as painful as $5 for me, or certainly $5 when I was in graduate school, for example. Some other work has showed that, of course, the amount can make a difference. So spending more money is worse, but also the face value. So have you ever experienced that notion where you don't want to really break that 20? You don't want to break that $50 bill. But then as soon as it's broken, or let's just say we had 5 $10 bills, that feels a lot easier to spend. And it probably goes a lot quicker. And that face value acts as a barrier, right, for us, and serves as this physical cue, right, and this like visual and salient cue that prevents us from spending at that given time. Right? And then when you break it and you have these different other face values, you don't associate it with as consequential of a payment, right? And it doesn't feel as painful. Okay. In addition to that, as I mentioned a little earlier, the form of money can also make a difference. So, as I mentioned, of course, paying more is then more painful than paying less money. So $1 versus, let's say, 4 quarters or a quarter. But in addition to that, so cash and that legal tender of money, that's the most painful. Next on that list is check. And what scholars have argued is that basically with check, even though you can write $5 or you can write $50, right? It's the same one check, right? And you're forking that check over. Just that writing in that amount, right? And then having to write it out in letters and in full, saying $5, acts as a memory cue, right? It's a visually salient reminder of the fact that you're spending this money. So that is more painful than, for example, the next items on these lists, which are plastic. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the timing of payment matters, but when it comes to plastic, there actually hasn't been that much work until, I guess, the closest thing I'll show you is some recent work that I've done with two colleagues. But there's not as much work done to say, is there differences between plastic itself? So, for example, a gift card versus a debit card versus a credit card. Right? So there is this idea, but when we're actually spending, there's no real empirical difference. So we're grouping them all together about the concept of plastic here. And one of the reasons why is that with plastic, it's not as painful as, let's say, check and the actual cash, largely because what you hand over, maybe what you even tap, right? You're going to get that same plastic right back at you in the same form that you gave it. And so you don't feel that physical transparency and outflow of money in the same way. And finally, we've done some of the, towards the end of this talk, we'll talk about this, we've done some recent work that this is basically, now that we're moving into mobile and online payment, relative to even card, this is even less painful. Because my phone, right, that to me is a communication device, a social device. It's not even a reminder of money in the same way that the card is. So it doesn't feel as painful as, for example, spending by plastic or these other forms. Similarly, like online, or with your computer, spending online, let's say at Amazon, that's not as painful because, again, you're not seeing that because maybe we think of our computer as our work device, for example. And so this is a little bit of the spectrum and some understanding. And we're going to use these different kind of categories of paper, right, versus plastic, versus then even digital, when we look at some of these effects, right? So how does the pain of payment influence consumer psychology and spending? So we're going to first start off with 2 quick studies on how we think about money in our purchase deliberation and whether or not we choose to even make a purchase. And I'm going to start with this because there's this old, and many of you guys might be very familiar with this, but this concept of choice overload. And the idea with choice overload is that initially we want more choice. That if we give people more alternatives, they in fact are more likely to make a purchase, right? Some work I did in undergrad basically is consistent with this. You're more likely to find something that meets your preferences as a consumer. As a firm, it caters to different consumers. And then consumers, of course, love the freedom of choice. They say, well, I feel more satisfied if I have at least more options to choose from. But after that particular point, then we get overwhelmed. Right? There's this cognitive cost of comparison. We have to figure out, well, now there's multiple items that meets our needs. And so this creates a lot of anticipated regret, a little frustration. We feel overwhelmed, we feel anxious, and that actually leads to detriment in our kind of overall well-being. So that ends up leading to individuals saying, I'm going to walk away, I'm not going to make a purchase altogether because I don't want to have to go through this stressful event, right? And make that choice. And so what I was interested in is this inverted U relationship, right? Could the way that we pay influence the propensity to experience choice overload? Could it influence the likelihood that we start basically being overwhelmed by choice? And so what I did that was pretty simple here was I took the same type of paradigm. And so I gave people different assortment sizes to choose from of black pens. And what I told the individuals was that they can buy this from their own money, right? And typically those pens are about $2, right? And they're just going to have a different choice, but when different choice of, basically I varied the different increments in fours, so 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, to really mimic that previous design to see if basically small choice sets, medium choice sets, and then large choice sets. But what I did was I told individuals that in one condition, I said, you can only pay for this using $1 or I have change for you, but you have to use cash. Right? And in the other condition, I said, I can't accept any cash. I can only accept student card. And the student card was like a debit card at the time. So you had to put money in and then you would take it out and spend in that form, right? So in one condition, right, they had to only pay by cash, the other one by card. So with cash, we replicated this inverted U. So people initially loved the amount of alternatives that were offered and so then bought more, right? But then as it kept going and there's more alternatives, people felt stressed. And they basically responded to that stress and that cognitive cost of comparison and all that frustration involved by buying less, even though they had more options to choose from. That's the black bars represent cash. But with plastic and the plastic student cards, initially, there's no difference between cash and card. People are just as likely to make a purchase, right? So they are feeling this benefit, oh, more alternatives. I'm more likely to find something that meets my needs. But unlike cash, they continued to keep buying. So there was no significant difference after the 10 pen condition and 10 choices as there were 18. So people were not experiencing this cognitive cost of comparison, these affective costs. They're still buying at a high rate. So one thing we wondered, we said, well, paying by card, that's clearly moderating this inverted U shape. Okay. So let's manipulate this in a different way. If this is really a story about this payment, let's manipulate it via the actual, is this really a cash effect versus a card effect, or is this really about this payment concept? And so going back to the magnitude, making it cheaper or more expensive. And so in this case, we basically did the same sort of thing. So we had either 4, 10, or 16 choices that you could choose from, either cash or card, same thing. But we also varied how much these pens cost. In one condition, we said it's $1, just like before. Then in another condition, we said, well, it's going to be really cheap. It's a quarter versus it's $2. And like I mentioned, the retail price of these pens are about $2. So it's just giving you the retail price. So in this case, we ended up finding at the $1 condition, so when these pens were a little bit on sale. With cash, you see the inverted U. With card, you're not seeing that negative consequence of this increased choice set. But when we made it cheaper, nobody was really experiencing this negative experience of having more alternatives. When we made it more expensive, both groups, regardless of how you paid, were experiencing this choice overload. So if we understand this, basically, the way that we pay, particularly at certain points, depending on where you are and what you're purchasing, and how much it's priced, obviously, we can see that the way that you pay, how much you pay, can really influence the likelihood that you're going to experience this, anguish that you might experience with higher and larger number of options and larger assortment sets. Okay. So then the question is, what could be going on here? Well, so then another thing that I ended up doing was saying, well, let's see what people even think about when they're basically just making this decision of spending. So what I had individuals do is this is an online experiment. I said, well, imagine you have some extra money. You decide to go in and spend $20 on this pair of headphones, right? You wanted these headphones. They're a good deal. You've been thinking about buying these, and it's available for the price of $20, so you spend it. You go to the checkout, and in one condition, I told them you're going to spend with $20. $20 cash bill. You hand that cash to the salesperson. In the other condition, I said you hand your card to the sales clerk. Okay. So again, they're spending debit card. Again, $20, same thing, same headphones. Right? They're making the spending decision. But what I actually asked them to do before I show you the results is right after that, right after I told them they're going to spend, I said, well, what else could you spend your money on, right? Your $20 on? And what I was interested in is, I gave them 30 seconds. What I was interested in is, what, off the top of their head, what else are they thinking about that they're trading off with this money? Right? And this is an idea of how fungible is this money? How valuable? Because the value of money is really defined by what else you could make a purchase on. And so if you list more items in this 30-second period, then that means you think that instead of spending it on this, you can think of more even alternatives, not just within the choice set itself, like the previous study, but even what are you trading off outside of that just assortment set, right? What are you thinking of outside the headphones? So I asked people with cash that, I asked the people with card that. Right? And this is going to help us get an understanding of what's going on here. Do people feel like there are different trade-offs that they're making, right? And that there's more consideration of other opportunities where they could spend their money? And indeed, that's exactly what I saw. For cash people, they listed more items that they could purchase in just that 30-second period. And again, the reason I bounded it, right, to 30 seconds is because I wanted people to see what comes to top of mind. And I counted those unique items just in that few minutes. Cash people are listing far more things versus the debit card people for the same form of money in the same kind of purchase context. But then I thought to myself, well, instead of just counting the number, right, maybe it's worthwhile to count the number of product categories. So for example, you could have listed water, soda, coffee, right? But those are all drinks. So maybe you're saying, oh, I'm only spending all this money on the headphones on other drinks. But instead, how about if you said something like water, socks, maybe pay off a parking ticket, maybe I have some debt that I need to deal with, books. Now you're thinking of money in a much more fungible way. And indeed, that's exactly what I saw again, that now cash people are not only thinking of a greater number of items, but they're also thinking of a greater number of product categories from where those items come from. So in other words, we could think of this as they're listing more items, so there's more opportunities across a more fungible range of goods, right? And more categories, product categories, right? So that could be something that's going on that's preventing the cash folks from even spending to begin with, right? Very similar to my experience of not wanting to fork over that money to the Starbucks barista. Right? I was thinking maybe more so with cash than I was with card, all the other opportunities that I could spend my $5 for my latte on. So what are the consequences of this? Let's go back to that latte experience. So now we can see that it affects the likelihood we make a choice, how much we deliberate, and whether we make that buying decision. It affects even the opportunity cost consideration. Well, what happens post-transaction, right? What happens to that latte, for example, after we've made the spending decision? In the way that we pay affect our connection with what we bought, loyalty. So what I did here was I did a very simple experiment where I was selling mugs. Right? I went around and there's these mugs that are typically $6.95 at the Duke bookstore. And I went around to different people and I sold this mug for $2. But similar to that pen experiment, in one condition, I sold it via, that I said that you can only spend with cash. In the other condition, I said you can only spend with card. Right? I used like the Square payment technology. And I said I could take credit, I could take debit, I could take your student card, anything, but I just can't take any cash. Right? For the cash folks, I did have change available. And what I measured was, well, of course, buying. So about in both conditions, about 2/3 of people bought. It was a good deal. Okay, so there weren't those big differences in the likelihood that they're going to make a spending decision because it was cheap. But now I was interested in this post-transaction connection. So after I made the sale, I came back to them on average about 2 hours later. Okay? I told them, hey, I'm a graduate student, right? Was at the time. I said, I made a huge mistake. I need to buy that mug back from you. I need to take it back. So how much are you willing to accept for this mug? And what that's measuring is this idea that if you say a higher value, right, for how much that you're willing to accept, that means you value the mug more. You feel more connected to it. I also asked how emotionally attached are you to the mug. Okay. Now, most people didn't even use the mug just yet, but I still want to measure these things. I also asked them, really what we think is driving this whole thing, how painful was paying for the mug when you originally purchased it? And finally, I asked them, well, just like some previous work, I wanted to know, well, what would you be willing to pay for not this mug, but any other mug? All right? They think about money and their spending habits when it's these different forms of payment. So let's talk about the value of money. Right? So this is now, what are you willing to pay for any mug? Not this particular mug, but any other mug typically. Okay? We want to see how valuable people think their money is and their spending habits. What happened here is that card people, okay, they had a higher willingness to pay. And this is consistent with some previous work. Some previous work in this area has showed that individuals who pay by card, right, in any form, debit card, credit card, in plastic basically, versus cash, they're more likely to have higher tipping amounts. Right? They're more likely to list higher auction amounts, right? For an auction, they'll bid higher amounts. They're more willing to pay. And so basically, and we're replicating that work here. So it's not that these people are any different. For any given object, they don't find money as valuable. Right? And so they're likely to want to spend a little bit more. But when it came to this mug that they already made the purchase on, what happens there? Right? And as I mentioned, the mug was $6.95. Now, the card people, they showed an endowment effect, right? So it's $6.95, but I sold it for $2. They're just showing the endowment effect because they're still willing to sell this back to me at a almost 2 times the amount, $3.83. But compared to cash people, on the other hand, they wanted for this endowment effect, right? Their value of this actual mug, the connection that they feel there. They're saying they want maybe on average about $3 more. They're saying they want $6.71 on average for this particular mug back, right? Despite the fact that just 2 hours on average earlier, they got it for $2. So payment method and spending by cash makes us feel more connected, and we find this mug more valuable, right, that we spend on. In addition, people reported feeling more emotionally attached to this mug. They've only had it for 2 hours, but they feel connected to it. So the question is, well, why does this effect occur? Again, let's go back to this notion of pain of payment. So what's going on here? Well, when you put this pain of payment into this context, this is what's really driving this particular relationship. And this is the whole basis of this argument. So while in certain circumstances, pain can act as a deterrent for spending, right? So cash, for example, makes you feel pain of payment, which reduces you from spending. If you've spent, then that pain now flips, right? And it's consistent with these notions of cognitive dissonance and self-perception, right? That we say, well, why did I go through this painful experience? It must be because I value this particular item. Right? It must be because I feel attached to it. That it feels part of me now. It feels like I don't want to give it up. We feel more connected. And that's a way that we go through these decisions. That we say, well, what we have, when we made a purchase on, it must be, at least when you have more pain, that's really what's driving this post-transaction connection. Okay? And so what we can think about from all these few experiments, the first half of the first bit of this talk, right, is understanding that, well, the way that we pay influences how we think about opportunity cost, right, the perceived value of money. It also influences our feelings of connection and explains this pain of payment explains why cash and more painful forms give us more connection and make us feel more connected. But of course, we have a lot of other questions. Does the way that we pay affect maybe these mugs and the kind of durable type of goods, right? Like such as, a physical product. Could it affect our loyalty, the likelihood that we're going to go back to Starbucks for again? How long does this effect last? So I said 2 hours, right? That was my first particular study in this. But how about, let's say, 1 year later? And again, does this even really matter when we're thinking about all the mess of real-world data? And finally, non-cash payments. As I said, we're moving to other forms of currency. Really, is it about this continuum of the different forms of payment and how they trigger different levels of payment? So the way that I looked at loyalty was I looked at charitable giving, particularly in the context of alumni giving. So I got this neat data set from Alumni Association at a private Southeastern business school. And so they gave me this 9-year database of all alumni donations from June 2004 to June 2013. Okay? So 9 years. And what I was interested in is, does the way that people donate, comparing check, the check payment versus card, does the way that you donate in a given time period, so in a given year, influence your likelihood of donating in the following year, so T+1. Right? So to start off, I just looked at, again, this particular trend. So what's the proportion donated? So with card, if you donate in a given year by card, you're 56.7% likely to make a repeat donation, okay, in that following year. If you donate by check, it's 62.3%. So we can think of it as a relative change, about 10% in repeat giving. But of course, you might have some questions about this. Right, so let's think about, well, what else is going on? Right? So it could be that there might be other drivers. of this, right? So we want to control for a number of different things. Maybe gender. How about graduating class year so that we have an idea of whether age plays a role? How about even whether they attended reunions, right? There's a paper on that. And then we wanted to look at donor usage checks. We also wanted to control, because this is a story about commitment. So I wanted to control for the amount that you donate. Because, for example, if you don't have much money, you might only be able to donate, let's say, and I very much relate to this as a graduate student at the time, I might have only donated $100 in a given year. But what I'm interested in is this habit of donating, feeling that I'm committed to this. So again, making that repeat $100 donation in the given year, right, the following year. And then I was looking at this cross-level interaction. Does the way that you donate in year T plus the, multiplied by this donor uses checks, does that increase the likelihood, or is that associated with the increase in the likelihood of you donating in T plus 1? And in fact, it did. That more painful form, check, predicts connection over time. But a question you could ask is, well, who even writes checks? Could you think of this as maybe it's wiser, older adults, wealthier people, right? That's one of the reasons I control for the amount of money. So here is my attempt at reducing that. So I took all the people that donated with check in year 1. And then I said, well, all these people, because maybe they're just different, right? They're already connected because that's the way that they chose to donate. How about if they switched, right? From check, they switched to card, versus they went from check and didn't make a switch, and they stayed with check. What happens in year 3? What's their likelihood in year 3 to make that donation? Okay. What we found is as follows. If you make a check card donation, right, and you make that switch from a more painful to a less painful, you're 72.2% likely to make a repeat donation in that year 3. Check, 80%. So again, that's about a relative change of 10%. Right? This is 1 year later. Right? So switching to that less painful form, that reduces that repeat that donation likelihood. And I checked a number of different types of models. So I said, well, let's check single years. Right? I checked even just all these different year effects as well, because the recession happened as well. Another thing that's an interesting trend I should make a note is that I'm not saying here that to the Alumni Association that switch over to card, right? Or basically reduce card, not that, right? Reduce card transactions because people have this repeat giving. Because in any given year, people are more likely to donate via card, right? But they're just not likely to make that repeat donation. And one thing I should finally note about this is that I also tried 3 years, then what's your year 4 likelihood? And what you do see is that once you've donated after 3 years, you're then more likely to make a donation. You're like about 99% likely to make that repeat donation in year 4. So because it's the idea of habit, right? Then you can't break that bond because you're really making that habitual donation. So that's a good marker of how we should think about this as well, okay? One thing that I should also note is that many card users during this period too were on this automatic payment, and yet still, so then basically they were automatically renewed each and every year, but yet still check seems to persist that there's this greater commitment, all right? And so really we're seeing this strong effect in this given year, right? So now with the last few minutes, I want to talk about what's going on in today's payment society. Our payment is now these physical differences in terms of paying by check versus card, or paying by even plastic versus online, right? Even thinking about cash versus card. These physical differences are being obscured because we're now resorting to mobile and online kind of technologies, and we have many accounts here on our phone, right? And many accounts that are on our phone are accessible to us online, right? And while the physical differences were critical then, now we see this rise in basically all of these different payment forms that are really just on one device. So what happens? With Apple Pay, Venmo, doesn't all money just look the same? So then is this moot? Turns out it's really not about just the form, but it's about how we think about money. So for us, we have many different, for consumers psychologically, we have different forms of different stores of money and the way that we think about our monetary resources. And for many individuals, they go in Bank of, so this is the US, right? So Venmo versus Bank of America, for example, right? Bank of America now has an ability for you to make transactions and send that to your friends, just like an Interact, right? And so you can send money requests with a thing called Zelle. And what we ended up finding was that with individuals, when they spent and had to part with their money using like an Interact or from their checking account, like a Zelle, they felt that that was more painful than when they first transferred it to Venmo and then spent that same amount of money then. And the reason why is that we have these strong associations with money, such as our checking account, that we're always checking our checking account much more, right? And that means that that's a typical resource for us in the way that we think about money. When we switch over to something like Venmo, by moving money from one form to the next, right, even though we haven't spent it, it actually feels painful, even though we haven't spent a dime. So an implication of some of this stuff is that, and some of this new work that we're doing is that, in fact, you don't really even need to pay in order to feel pain of payment. Taking the money out of your checking account, either maybe in cash or sending it directly to a friend through Interact, that feels, or sorry, to Venmo instead of going right directly to Interact, even if we haven't spent a dollar, that feels painful to individuals. We did a neat study too to make sure that it wasn't just about these online payments and the switching of this currency. So we went from cash, we had people go cash, right? And they kept their money, right? We had them do basically arcade games versus they went from cash to then they switched it to tokens, even though they can switch it back, right? And then they played games with this. Well, the people that kept it in cash, even though they can switch it back at any point, they felt that it was more painful to part with their money when they played with the arcade games than the people who then felt that played with the tokens. So for these guys, going from cash to token was more painful, right? But then less painful than when they're actually parting with the token to play the game itself. And so there's a potential that it's not just driven by these, just the form of money, but it's the way that we think about these accounts. That's really what's going on here. So overall, to wrap up, right, is that there are downsides, certainly to cashless convenience. But in some ways, we have to think about it's not all bad, right? Because cash, or at least any time that you can, think about, well, can I make it a painful experience? Because even for me, as a firm, right, you care about this in terms of customer turnover, you care about retention, but even for me, I care about not wasting things, right? Not disposing, not buying so many different types of mugs or different products. I want to really care about what it is that I spend on. But now that we're moving into these digital forms, taking money directly from our checking account and spending on maybe hedonic things like a mug or fun night out, we might want to go directly from our checking account rather than go to Venmo first, because that creates that increased pain relative to transferring it to Venmo. But what we could use this notion of this transferring money for is using it for some of our savings goals. Because then it might, moving the money immediately, right, then it might make it feel like we have less money to actually spend from. And so that money that's in the store of our checking account, even though we spent it on savings, right, then we're actually curtailing our spending from time to time. So I do think that there are some ways that we can then really basically increase the pain or increase our savings using this financial technology. And so with that, I will thank a number of my co-authors, as well as Bear, Liz Kang, Laura Goodyear. I know I'm going to get questions and questions from Laura soon. And then Dilip Soman, of course, who did some of this work as well, and for the previous prior work in pay-to-payment, but also is our fearless Bear leader, in addition to many of our chief scientists and fellows. And then, of course, you guys. And I'm very excited for you guys to join me and to talk about this thing and basically any of your questions. Would love to chat. All right. So with that, Laura, I know you have some things lined up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Avni. Really interesting stuff. So you talked quite a bit about people's connections to products depending on how painful they perceive the payment to be. So I'm just wondering, like, how does or if the method of payment and how painful it is impact interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, actually, so there was a number of studies I did on this as well, and so I'll just give you a big like overview. So let's think about a scenario such as, maybe you're going out on a date, and you're hoping that goes well, or basically there are many occasions where we treat our friends or we're treated, right? A friend takes us out. In fact, about 4% of our spending is this interpersonal in nature, at least, right? It's for the purpose of somebody else. So what happens there? Well, indeed, Laura, that's a great question, because pain of payment will influence even our feelings of connection with even each other. And so more painful forms, right, if it's someone we like, right? Hopefully you like your date, I guess, or you like the person that you're treating, then having a more painful form where you're treating somebody, let's say I'm now buying Laura a coffee, right? Then that not only influences the way that I feel and the pain of payment I feel with parting with money, but then the connection I feel towards Laura. But then also, even as the recipient, so for Laura, it also influences the way that she feels about me. Seeing that pain that I incurred, she's more likely to like me more because she says, well, I guess she's going through this for me. So it serves as another signal relative to, let's say, card. Now, the one caveat I'll give is that it's not always that pain always leads to positive cues and like basically an amplification of positive emotions, but sometimes it can be negative. So if you're paying for, let's say, a competitor, somebody who you don't want or you don't like, right? Then in fact, that is now even a reminder that that pain of payment is even worse for you, right? Where then you feel, oh, I like this person even less relative to if you had spent via card. Right? And sometimes we have to do this, right? Where we just reluctantly treat someone and then it feels even worse, right? And for that other person, they feel worse too because they know that if there's if they feel a need to want to reciprocate the emotion because they don't want to feel in debt to somebody that maybe they don't have such positive relationships with. So the caveat I'll give is that when you like something, spend cash. It's good for everybody involved. It's even good for your product connection, your brand connection, and then of course your interpersonal connection. But if something you don't like, right, maybe even that parking ticket I mentioned, right, then you want to make sure that it's the least painful form because it's not going to amplify that negative emotion that you feel.
Great. So we have one last question just quickly from one of our participants. So they're curious if you've examined the differences between credit and debit. Given that credit creates a temporal lag between purchase and payment, would you expect credit would be associated with less pain of payment than debit?
Yeah, so some work that I had mentioned earlier, they basically argued it's about this temporal coupling. But what's interesting is that it's been hard to find that empirically with plastic, right? So with just basically in my wallet right now, I have both a credit card and a debit card, right? So I have these two forms, but they're both plastic. And so with that, people have not found a difference empirically with this plastic form, the differences in plastic. However, I think the closest point, because I think that there is some idea of this temporal coupling and what we see. So there is some element there, absolutely. And I think that the last study that I mentioned about whether it's like something like an Interact that goes directly from your checking account versus, let's say, you go from your checking account to Venmo, that there is a temporal coupling there, at least a little bit. And that basically shows that when it's from your checking account directly, that will feel more painful than when you first transfer it to another account such as a Venmo and then spend from there. And so I think that speaks to a little bit of this temporal coupling aspect. So spend from your checking account would be the best way to put it because it feels worse. It feels like a real store of your wealth versus with Venmo, we're not we have weaker associations with that as our kind of store of money.
Okay, great. Well, again, we'd like to thank Avni for leading our webinar today. And a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. We'd like to thank you all again for attending, and thank you again, Avni. And you can exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen.